hands to provide us with a little introduction.
Well, thanks so much, Michael. Thanks for the lovely introduction. Thank you for inviting me here. It's great to see all of you here this afternoon. One thing that might not have been conveyed in my bio is that though I mostly do work now on contemporary American literature, I actually studied German literature in college and graduate school. So this novel feels very much in my field, as it were, and it's great to be among so many other German literature enthusiasts. So I just want to start by saying, yeah, like Michael, and I think probably like many of you, I was, of course, familiar with the work of Elias Canetti, but I had never heard of Veza Canetti before learning about this book. And I have this edition, which probably many of you have too. I don't even know if there is another English language edition. And my attention was piqued by the foreword in this edition, which is by Elias Canetti. And he makes a comment on the first page of that foreword that, just sent my biographer's radar pinging madly. So at the bottom of the page, he says, Veza, and I'm not even sure actually how to pronounce her name. It's Veza or Veza. I'm going to say Veza, had a great admiration for offbeat characters. So far, so good. We definitely see that in this book. In the stories she was to write in the following years, he's referring to the years after they met, which was when they were quite young. He was 20, she was 28. I'm going to talk a little bit about their life together. Such characters were to appear often. For the most part, they were victims, the kind that suffered from the injustices done them by others, the defenseless, cripples, the less astute. But most of all, she loved to write about women who were being destroyed in the service of others or by a disastrous marriage. She extolled such victims by giving plausibility to their charm. And this is the sentence that really got me here. And although not one single one of these creations was modeled on herself, although none of them resembled her in the slightest, it seemed nevertheless as if she had formed them all around the one same core, that of her own integrity. And so I don't know about you, but when I read a woman's husband saying, absolutely not, these oppressed, unhappily married women were absolutely not based on her own character. No, certainly not. In case you didn't hear the first time, I'm going to say it again. They definitely were not autobiographical at all. I could not help but wonder. And so I did a little bit of research into Veza Canetti's life and the Canetti's marriage, which I'll just share with you briefly now. Just give me one moment here to organize my screen. Let's see. I want to make Zoom a little bit smaller and my PowerPoint a little bit bigger. Okay, this should work. I'm going to share part of my screen. Oh, give me 1 second here. Good. Okay, so you should now be able to see my PowerPoint. Is this working? Good. I am just going to adjust things a little. There we go. Okay. So Elias Canetti, right, the author of the novel Auto da Fe, in German Die Blendung, the nonfiction work Crowds and Power, winner of the Nobel Prize in 1994. And, we all know about this great man. Mysteriously enough, none of us have heard anything about his wife. So here's a photo of Veza Canetti that I found on the internet. So she was born in 1897. As I said, she's about 8 years older than her future husband, to a Viennese middle-class family. And she met her husband, who was born to Spanish-speaking Jews in Bulgaria in 1914. They met in Vienna in 1925. He was 20, she was 28. She was a part-time English teacher and translator who had actually been a friend of his mother's. This is a whole other story that I don't feel I have sufficient background on to get into. Her own family came from Belgrade and Sarajevo, and a really interesting detail that I found actually is that they spoke Ladino at home, as did Canetti's family, and the two of them spoke it together in their marriage. They called it their secret language. So, and this is, okay, another very interesting thing. You can't really see it in this picture, but there was a deformity to her left arm, which obviously is something that we might discuss, the way she portrays characters who are deformed, especially, of course, the shopkeeper Rumpel in Yellow Street. It would seem that in this way, at least, she may in fact have something in common with at least one of her characters. This is the building where Veza Canetti grew up. Oh, whoops, why is that not happening? I'm gonna try again. Here we go. Okay. She lived at Ferdinandstrasse 29 in Vienna's Leopoldstadt neighborhood. This is the same neighborhood where Yellow Street is set. It's a neighborhood that was about half Jewish before the war. You can see that this building where she lived, this is my very bad screenshot of it from Google Street View. But there's in fact no reason to think that it might not have looked much the same in Veza Canetti's day, except for this more modern looking building that has sprung up right next to it. And we see a lot of the texture of Viennese daily life in the stories, right? We see, in addition to all the Leopoldstadt street scenes, there's Herr Wulk, who visits the waxworks in the Panopticon in the Prater amusement park. So as I said, this looks like a really nice, very respectable middle-class building, but that background is only part of the story economically of Veza Canetti's life. In fact, her stepfather cut her out of his will. And in 1934, the same year that she and Canetti were married, her mother died, which left them without any money whatsoever. So she did, in fact, it would seem that she knew some of the penury that her characters experience, and that desperateness to scrape together money for food and shelter that comes out in the stories, feels very emotionally grounded in her own experience. So she began publishing her stories in the early 1930s under the pseudonym Veza Mugged, and you can see that here on the screen. Magd actually means maid. Obviously, a very kind of self-effacing, self-erasing pen name that suggests, the invisible family servant, the helper that all middle-class houses would have employed in those years. Her 1933 story, The Canal, which appears in Yellow Street, was one of her last stories for the Arbeiterzeitung, which was banned in 1934. She published a few more stories in other papers. These stories are of the variety that used to be known as the feuilleton, a form that also was used by Stefan Zweig, Joseph Roth, many other Austrian and German writers of those years. And it's a form that in New Yorker parlance, we might call it used to be called the casual. I don't think anybody uses that term anymore, but it's a diaristic form that often blends fiction and nonfiction, is based on observations of daily life, much less kind of centered around a plot in the way that we usually think of that. Then again, observations, texture, characterization, and other forms that have something in common with also with memoir and with reportage. The blend of fiction and nonfiction also has been picked up by other contemporary writers now, especially. I would just highlight the work of W.G. Sebald, as well as the many contemporary writers who have been influenced by him. So in addition to the stories that were collected in Yellow Street, we can talk about also the genre to which this book belongs. Is it, would we call it a novel? Would we call it a collection of linked stories? I think it's, you could make a case for either one. She also wrote a play called The Ogre that is, I think, also draws on the stories of that title in Yellow Street, as well as another collection of stories translated as Patience Brings Roses. And she wrote all of this while they were living in Vienna. They fled Vienna for London in 1938. And in London, they lived in obscurity and also often in poverty. And in London, Veza began writing a novel called The Tortoises, that is meant to be her most autobiographical work, based somewhat on her own experience living in exile. And I'll just read this lovely passage that I've highlighted here. Exile falls heaviest of all on the poet. His soul is made of language. The characters that he creates are his body. He can only breathe where his language is alive and his life is extinguished, when he can no longer understand and be understood. Perhaps this is why this sentence affects the poet so much, although he has been ready to make the decision for a very long time. Although he forces everything in himself toward a separation, although he regards it as a stroke of fate if he succeeds in emigrating to a foreign country, if a new world opens its doors to him, if he is granted entry and not turned away on the threshold, if his good name smooths his path to a new homeland, for he is sure of one thing: he will not begin his journey lightly. He will fall back in weariness. There will be struggles, fear unto death. Fear now holds sway at the heart of Europe, whose inhabitants used to be known for their kindness, whose houses were history, whose women sang songs by Schubert. Fear wears a brown uniform and the swastika. I find this passage so evocative, not only because of what we can infer from the way it expressed Veza's experience, as well as her husband's fleeing Vienna for their exile in London, but also how different it is in mood from her tone in Yellow Street. You can really feel the events of the 1930s and how they must have affected her in the way they're reflected here in her writing. And at this point, the Canetti's careers start to diverge in really a very dramatic way. And while Elias Canetti seems to have been carried through these years of exile and obscurity by his own self-confidence and his sense of his talent and his belief in his mission as a poet and a writer, Veza instead supported him. And at this point, she began devoting her energies almost entirely to supporting her husband in his work. And so the story of their marriage, which was an unconventional marriage, is also the story of her obscurity. This here is Elias Canetti's explanation in a memoir that he wrote in the 80s, long after she had died, of the unconventional terms of their marriage. He says, Veza wanted to keep us away from any of the usual pressure to be tied down. A poet, she believed, had to be free under all circumstances. He could only feel tied insofar as his inner necessity allowed him, and when that was no longer so, he should feel himself free to love another woman without conflict and to preserve his feelings of trust and friendship for the first woman would always mean very much. It should be possible for him to turn to her in emotional distress without shyness. He should continue to speak to her about everything which uplifted or troubled him. Nothing should change between them apart from the one thing, for which there are no rules and no laws, at the very most, ties. So the way this played out in reality was that he had many affairs, including with Alma Mahler and in London with Iris Murdoch. And Veza encouraged him and befriended his lovers. A friend referred to their relationship as one almost of like mother and son. This person called her a Mütterchen, meaning a homemaker who was always there for her unfaithful and younger husband, who was her protege, whom she guarded and mothered and cooked and shopped for. And it's interesting, I think, to think about the kind of puzzling contradiction between the feminism of Veza Canetti's fiction and the way that in reality she seems to have entirely subordinated herself to her husband's needs. And so while they lived in London, she wrote The Tortoises, the novel about exile that we just looked at briefly. She wrote at least one more play. She translated a Graham Greene novel. I believe it was The Power and the Glory, apparently with great distinction. There may be more work of hers that was lost because apparently some previously uncollected stories turned up in the early 2000s. And this work wasn't promoted either by Veza or by Canetti. It was left to fall into obscurity. Meanwhile, when Canetti began Crowds and Power, which she started writing in 1948, she devoted herself to the project. She took on the obligation of his correspondence, as well as reading the text and correcting it. Canetti himself commented on her obsessiveness regarding his own literary career. She made him sit at his desk for certain hours in the day. She put off visitors who might have intruded upon him. She wrote letters on his behalf. She edited an anthology of his writing for him. And so it's possible that her lack of commercial success may have been because she tried, to the extent that she and her husband did promote her work, they promoted her plays rather than her stories, which most critics and readers have judged to be superior. And it's also true, of course, that many other writers suffered obscurity after fleeing into exile, such as H.G. Adler, whose works only regained attention much, much later. Also, other female German writers such as Irmgard Coin, among them. But nonetheless, it can't be denied that her husband, at the very least, acquiesced in her obscurity rather than trying to gain the kind of recognition for her work that she might have enjoyed during her lifetime. She died on May 1st, 1963, at age 65. She was a smoker, and she apparently died of a pulmonary embolism. And Canetti outlived her by more than 30 years. He didn't begin republishing her work until the 1990s. So basically, there is almost half a century of total silence from her. She told one emigre writer who was friends with both of them that she didn't want her work to be known until after her husband was already famous, which didn't actually happen during her lifetime. So while there doesn't seem to be evidence that he prevented her from writing, it also doesn't seem that he encouraged her to do so. And in fact, I think maybe one of the saddest and most telling details is that in the entirety of his 3-volume autobiography, Elias Canetti never mentioned that his wife was also a writer. And so I'll wrap up with that and open things up now to our conversation.